Thank you all for sticking around and joining us for this final discussion of the day. We're talking about the future of space, commercial space, military space, and the importance of this topic to everyday life. I tell you, this was kind of a big eureka moment for me. A few years ago, I got to go out to, it says 5 years ago, Schriever Air Force Base. And they brought me into a room that was colder than every other room on base. And there were about 5 airmen in that room working on computers that were about as old as them. And I said, what are they doing? And it turns out that they were flying the GPS constellation that basically runs all of navigation, but also timing for basically every electronic transaction that is in every electronic trade and every ATM transaction. And it was like 5 people, and that was a few years ago. We've done a lot of work on those ground stations since then, but the importance of space to everyday life, certainly military life, but also civilian life, is absolutely huge, which is why we have the Space Force. So really quickly, Todd and General, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure, I'll go first. So Todd Harrison. So I was previously at CSIS. I think a lot of people probably know me from there. About a year ago, I moved over, started a new business unit within a larger company called Maitreya. My business unit is Maitreya Strategic Insights. We do strategy and policy research, external facing. And one of my favorite areas I still like to look at is what's going on in space, looking at from a quantitative edge. We recently published something called the Space Dashboard, where you can track, what's going on with launches and satellites in different countries, different sizes, and what missions they're after. And just trying to put that, interesting thought and takes out there. But yeah, my background is originally aerospace engineer and former Air Force as well.
Yeah. General Thompson.
Yeah, D.T. Thompson, Vice Chief of Space Operations for the Space Force. Basically the number 2 guy, which means I play the inside game at the Pentagon, work budget processes for the Space Force and with the other services in the department, requirements processes, personnel management, other those sorts of things, both inside with the headquarters staff of the Space Force, but also with the other services. And then my second job is to do whatever our boss, General Chance Saltzman, doesn't want to do, and I get to do that.
Okay. Great. Well, let me start with you, General. The 2024 budget request for you guys, $19.2 billion for research and development. And I think that we all understand now a lot of what the Space Force has been focused on, distribution of satellites in LEO, building a more resilient architecture for communications and also Earth monitoring and things like that. Very fundamental science and technology behind that. You have $19.2 billion request for research and development. What are the remaining challenges for you guys, technologically and scientifically, that you're trying to get to with that money?
Yeah, well, the first challenge isn't scientific or technological. It's getting a budget on time so that we can make full and effective use of that money in the entire budget, right? As you said, $19 billion for R&D, but a $30 billion budget overall.
Right.
Really, especially because our budget is growing, we have so much to do so quickly. When we don't get an on-time budget, not only can we not use the increase to get after the things we have to get after, but we're already behind from the previous year's CR, and so I think that's the first thing. Okay. But there are a tremendous number of missions migrating to space. We've talked in the past, made some major investments in reshaping what we do to track not just traditional ballistic missiles, but hypersonic weapons and other things. As you noted, we've done a major redesign of how we move data through space, how we communicate in space to support the future warfighting architecture. But we are also working intently with the community to do more advanced sensing from space. I've talked in the past, and we made a major investment in what we call ground moving target indication, tracking objects in the ground. We have more work to do there. We've got some other sensing things that we need to work with the National Reconnaissance Office, with the intelligence community, and with the other services to support how we expect to fight wars in the future.
Ground movement targeting. So when I think of like space-based imagery, I think of there's revisit rates that are now down to like, I think it's like half a day or something like that, or day.
Better than that.
Okay, a little better. Okay, great. And this is the stuff that is now driving our entire international discussion about what is happening in Europe, what is happening in the South China Sea. Our ability to form international coalitions is based so much on a lot of the space-based imagery. Moving targets, that is a military capability that now we want to have from, it used to be just drones, and now we think that we might be able to have this from space.
Yeah. Well, we need to have it from space because, as you know, from the drone perspective, that was permissive airspace, right? There was not really a contest for fight of the air. As you think about near-peer competitors and how those future conflicts will evolve, we have to assume we're going to do this in what is denied airspace, denied sea space, denied land space.
Yeah.
What is not denied every single day is space, outer space, space. And so we have to do it from there for certain in the early phases, and we have to make sure we know how to reliably do it even when under attack.
Okay. Todd, let me turn to you. If you're not familiar with the various lives of Todd, he used to work at CSIS, where one of the great gifts that he led in production for the public was this space threat report that came out on a regular basis, where he would look with his team at the space trends coming out of China and Russia, and really there's actually a wide diversity of different countries. What do you see as the primary objectives in the near term for China in terms of space access and also creating a contestable space?
Yeah, well, to pick up on what General Thompson was talking about, there are many more missions that are moving to space that can be augmented, supplemented by space-based capabilities, and it's exactly that advantage of, when you're in space, you have free right of overflight over every square inch of the Earth. You don't have that in the air domain, and so you can do things in space that are less provocative in peacetime and going all the way up into crisis, and including in the conflict when that airspace becomes heavily contested, you can still operate in space. And so that's when we're seeing more and more missions moving into the space domain. For those in the other services, they shouldn't see this as a threat, right? It's not going to replace your airborne capabilities, your other capabilities. It's going to give you the ability to do more of that in more circumstances. Now, our adversaries know that, right? And so they've been making, steady investments to hold our space assets at risk. There are a variety of ways we can defend against that. We actually published another report at CSIS about that. How can you defend against all of these forms of attack in space? But the key thing to keep in mind is in the competition with countries, primarily Russia and China, it's not a symmetric competition, right? They have space capabilities of their own. I don't want to sell them short at all, but their space capabilities to support their military are still nowhere near the kind of capabilities our military has in our intel community. They're making progress for sure. So are we, right? But where they have made a lot of progress is in threats that will hold our space systems at risk, counter space capabilities. And so that's where we've got to be cognizant of. We don't have to match, their progress in space. We need to match their progress in counter space with our defenses. And I've been discouraged for a while that we had been falling behind in that space counter space competition. I think we're doing a lot better now, especially when we're starting to see the deployment of these proliferated architectures of satellites in low Earth orbit that are just so much more difficult for an adversary to try to take out.
Yeah. So in terms of space defense strategies, I've heard a little bit about creating capabilities on satellites that help them maneuver a little bit. And there's sometimes talk about, can you put like a capability on them that would allow for like some sort of kinetic defense? But the number one strategy is proliferation, resilience through a proliferated architecture. So let me first take this question of like the threats and turn that to you, General. In terms of assured space-based capability, particularly for the Indo-PACOM AOR, we have now a nice proliferated architecture, but what is your biggest concern or challenge right now?
Well, and I would say it's exactly that, is to ensure that those capabilities are available to the Indo-PACOM commander and our military forces in conflict. And so, first of all, Ukraine taught us a couple things. The first is proliferation works.
Yeah.
It leads to resilient architectures, but we can't rest on our laurels in that regard. We have to understand that the human mind is ingenious and devious and will continue to look for ways to defeat it. But that's the first thing, is to make sure they're there. The other is that while proliferation works for a whole host of capabilities and missions, there will still be need for relatively large and small numbers of relatively large spacecraft, and we have to continue to understand how to defend and protect those against counter space attacks. And I think that's probably the biggest concern right now, ensuring we have enough resilience in both proliferated constellations and those small numbers of larger systems to be able to defend them in the course of a conflict while under attack.
Yeah, so that brings up a really good question. How does this trend in ever cheaper launch from a small number of providers and the proliferation of these LEO constellations, how does that change the relevance of some of those very important satellites like CBARs that are in these harder to get geo orbits where I think Frank Kindle and others have described them as big, fat, juicy targets? Are we going to see a diminishment of their relevance, or do you see them operating alongside these LEO constellations and continuing to be a part of it, or are they replaceable as a capability at any particular finite date?
So I would say the dependence and relevance of the orbit will be reduced as compared to everything else, but there are so many advantages to operating in geosynchronous orbit, I can't imagine it ever going away. But the opportunity to design an architecture that does a mission that has spacecraft in multiple orbital regimes, doing the mission in multiple ways, and oh, by the way, sometimes adding an air layer or adding a maritime layer, means that their overall criticality will be reduced, because we'll have other ways to accomplish the mission, and potentially reduce the fact that they may be a target because the adversary won't achieve a desired effect. But so in the greater context, that relative relevance is reduced. But I don't believe we will ever abandon the orbit or the need for large spacecraft for some certain sets of missions.
Okay. Yeah.
And the key is when you integrate at all those different levels, from GEO to MEO to LEO, all the way down the airborne layer, and maybe even terrestrial systems as well. When you integrate at all those levels, the more you integrate, the more resiliency you create, and you exponentially complicate the problem for the adversary.
Okay.
Right? And so that's what we want to be doing. We want to be creating exponentially growing problems for our adversaries, to the point that there's no way they're going to be able to take out these capabilities or be assured that they will take these capabilities out in a crisis.
Yeah, so it kind of speaks to the same driving ethos behind Joint Domain All Command and Control, where you're presenting a dilemma of problems to the adversary. So you can take out this shooter, you can take out this shooter, but you're still going to be swamped because their communication between them on targeting is such that you'll never know exactly where the hit is going to come from, and so you'll never know exactly where the capabilities come from, as long as you have this nice diversity. But a lot of that diversity depends right now on cheap launch. And we've been watching this trend in launch and the privatization of space with, I think, great enthusiasm from the public side. Launch costs getting cheaper and cheaper. Companies like SpaceX, doing sort of like more and more, achieving more and more heights. But there's a business model for these companies that might not be eternal. And I wonder, when you look at the commercial launch space in the next year or two, what are you seeing? Are you worried about consolidation, General?
Actually, I don't think I would say we're worried about consolidation yet, in the sense that when you look at our requirements and what we need to be delivered, which is really, I'll say it simply, is at least 2 paths to space for every important regime and mission we need, and a smaller responsive market. I think there will be enough opportunity and options in those 2 spaces for us for the long term. I will say there are a lot of launch providers out there, and I'm not an economist or an economic analyst, but you do wonder if all of those launch providers can be sustained over the long term. But I would say for sure there's certainly enough capability available today to meet our needs for the foreseeable future. In fact, the National Security Space Launch Phase 3 we're talking about, we start with the core of what we must have, and then we've put in that additional lane to be able to grow as more providers come online, and if they come online and they're viable, be able to use them.
Okay, Todd, are you seeing
Yeah, so I would say at the, to be a little more specific, the medium and heavy and super heavy classes of launch vehicles, there's not a lot of providers. It's already fairly well consolidated. If you set aside Russian and Chinese launch vehicles, not going to be using those.
Yeah.
But you've got SpaceX Falcon 9 family of launch vehicles. The Starship is in progress. You've got the Vulcan rocket from ULA. You've got Blue Origin with their New Glenn. Europeans, they've got the Ariane 5, and then soon the Ariane 6. That's about it, right? And if you look at the numbers, it's the Falcon 9 that is the workhorse by far. It's not even close, right? And once Starship gets up and going, I suspect it's going to be Starship that is that workhorse. And so I think there is some concern at the large end of the launch market that, well, maybe there aren't that many providers. Maybe we are getting to the point where we're a little too dependent on SpaceX. It would be nice to see some of these other companies make a little more progress, a little faster, and be cost competitive.
Right.
But that is something that is up to the free market, right, to dictate that. On the small side of the launch market, it is way too crowded. There are a lot of companies that have vehicles that are in various stages of development that haven't made it all the way through. There's a few that have actually made it and become operational. But we just saw one of those companies shut down. Virgin Orbit shut down its operations. The market just wasn't materializing in the way that they thought it would. I suspect, my prediction is within the next year or two, we're going to see more of these small launch companies just fold up shop. So I wouldn't say it's consolidation. I would say we're going to see some exits in the small launch market.
Okay. General, you have 2 assured paths to space. You're set there, but would your preference be for a more diverse LEO and maybe heavier launch market?
In that case, more is always better.
Okay.
But again, I think Major Thompson back in the late 90s was part of the Evolved Expendable Launch Vehicle program,
right,
which has been hugely successful in terms of the capability and reliability. Back then, though, we had developed an acquisition strategy that relied heavily on the commercial market.
Yeah.
And when that did not materialize, the strategy forced us to readdress it. But in this case, I think now, the way they have set it up with 2 assured providers and a lane for additional ones, we would love to have more, and I think the strategy that is developed now allows for that, and I think we would be excited to bring on more of those commercial providers.
It allows, do you know when you might begin to see that strategy pan out in the development of more providers?
I would not predict, I would not forecast that because I don't know. But okay. what I will say is there are absolutely enough providers out there pursuing capability today that we should be able to see folks in that additional lane pretty close to from the outset.
Okay, all right. And we're not too worried about over-reliance on one, even though, so you've got 2 companies, but the SpaceX business model, that is, you look at the economics, and they're doing much better. That is a lot cheaper. No concerns there.
Well, our requirement is for at least 2.
Yeah.
And in the past, when we haven't had 2 that were commercially viable, the government, the Air Force back then, paid the cost to ensure we had 2.
Okay.
I would assume in the future, if that became the case, we would. I'm not worried about that case, though, in the current market.
Okay, fair enough. Now keep in mind, we've got microphones here and here, so if you have questions, feel free to start stepping up to them. But beyond launch, there are a lot of entirely new business models that are springing up to kind of capitalize on space. You've got on-orbit servicing, you've got a lot of cyber things. What are the space startup areas that you think are the most interesting and that are going to maybe make the biggest impact on your life and maybe the lives of everyone here?
I'll let you start.
Sure. No, I think, like you said, on-orbit servicing is a really interesting one that can fundamentally shift the paradigm of how we use space and how we design space systems. I would compare it maybe to the paradigm shift from aerial refueling, right? That once you're able to actually go up there and reliably dock with a satellite, change out hardware, maybe refuel it, take it to a new orbit, and let it go, then you start to design your satellites differently, right? You start to design them to be more modular so you can hot swap payloads on them. Boy, that would have some pretty cool national security implications. Imagine if we just put a bunch of satellites, the ones we need to have in GEO, put them up there in GEO and have a servicer that can just move payloads in between them so an adversary never knows, hey, does that have a protected SATCOM payload on it, or does that have a missile warning payload on it, or is that something else, right? Keep them guessing as to what is where. That would be phenomenal. I mean, the economics of it too, so you're not wasting so much of the mass that you launch every time. So I think that's a really interesting area. But I think also proliferated constellations give you the ability to provide services that we've not been able to do before from space. So you were talking about GMTI before. You were asking, revisit rates of a couple times a day. What if you've got continuous revisit, right? What if there's always at least one satellite within view? What if there are always multiple satellites within view? So there are really interesting things, that you can pull from that. Now, it then creates a whole new set of challenges. You're sucking in all that data. How are you going to get that data down to the ground? How are you going to process it, exploit it, and actually get it into the warfighter's hand in a form they can use in a timely fashion? So I see a lot of interesting possibilities there. I will say this, that in some of these areas, many of these areas, where we see the leading edge work happen, it's not the government anymore.
Right.
It's commercial sector, right? On-orbit servicing, that's been demonstrated commercially, right? A lot of these highly proliferated constellations for remote sensing, they're commercial constellations that can sell to national security users. So I think that's where the cutting edge is right now.
Okay, General, because those two areas,
First, I absolutely agree with Todd with respect to on-orbit servicing. In fact, 2 years ago, we put out a requirement that said, we want this capability and we want to buy it as a commercial service. We don't want to build our own on-orbit refuelers and vehicles that might maneuver spacecraft around. But if that service is available, we want to be the customer of it.
Okay.
And in addition to what he talked about, proliferation, absolutely. And for me, the exciting part of this isn't just what we think we can do. It's what I'll call the unknowns out there that in some research university, in some corner of the entrepreneurial market, people are thinking about ways to do things from space that we're not even imagining. And the example I've used many times is the smartphone, right? And all those technologies were developed by research for national security purposes. It wasn't until the entrepreneurs got a hold of that technology that it created things in that smartphone that 10, 20, 30 years before we never would have dreamed of. And I feel like we're on the cusp of something like that with all the energy and ingenuity in the commercial space sector today.
Okay, I want to turn back to that in a second and try and figure out how much of this new capability has to exist on platform in space, how much of it needs to exist in space, then come on the ground. But let me first turn to Sandra. Sandra has a question for us.
Thank you so much, Patrick. Good afternoon, Sandra Irwin, Space News. I have a question for both of you. General Thompson, we heard General Saltzman talk at different hearings, talk about the competition with China. He uses the term competitive endurance. And I don't know if is that a buzzword or is that a real thing? And if you can maybe talk about what you all mean by competitive endurance. And the question for Todd is, since you've studied anti-satellite weapons extensively, what do you think would be the most alarming ASAT weapon that you think China has today? Thank you.
So I'll start with competitive endurance. So no, competitive endurance is really this idea that we are in a long competition with China. They absolutely believe it. While we're all focused, a lot of people are focused on and understand the challenge we face, and some people talk about the challenge we might face in the next 2 years, or the next 5 years, or the next 10 years. Those are absolutely challenges we face and we have to address. But we can't be thinking in terms of, okay, if we can get through the next 10 years, we're okay. Or it's not just what we're going to do in the next 5 years or 10 years to continue to be there and compete with China. It's what we do today, what we do tomorrow, what we do in 5 years, what we do in 10 years, not where we can't look at a finish line in this competition. And he wants us, Certainly there's rapid growth and a whole lot of things we've had to do fast to both create a service and compete and compete with China in terms of capabilities. But he wants us thinking about not just that and a finish line in that race. This is a long-term challenge that we have to think about, not just for 5 or 10 years, but for 10 and 15 and 20 and 50 years. And that's how he's trying to help us not change our mindset for the near term, but adjust our vision to the longer term as well.
Yeah, and to the space threat question, the things that concern me most are the forms of attack that are non-kinetic, that may not be publicly visible, that may not be irreversible in the damage that they provide, and China may believe they fall below the threshold of actually initiating conflict. I worry about those because they are more usable.
Yeah.
And I think we're more likely to see weapons like that used. So I'm talking about things like electronic warfare, jamming and spoofing of systems. We do see that quite a lot. I mean, not from China, but from a lot of other folks out there, jamming and spoofing our systems. Cyber threats, right? It is. Every weapon system has got some cyber vulnerability we've got to be concerned about. Space is no different. It's probably going to be in the ground segment that you got to be the most worried about. Could be on the space side as well. But also non-kinetic things like lasers that can blind sensors, RF systems that can blind radars, things like that. That an adversary, China or others, might think that they could get away with using that could severely hamper our ability to sense and to communicate from space. Those are the things I worry about most. And so we've got to be thinking about how do we build resilient architectures and platforms where those capabilities, if they're used against us, are not going to have the desired effect.
Yeah, it's so telling that right before the February 2022 Russia attack on Ukraine, there was actually a massive attack on satellite capabilities over Ukraine, and it was probably one of the larger cyber attacks that has ever occurred. You didn't hear about it because the context was actual kinetic war, but also because of the amount of time they spent developing resiliency. So they actually mitigated one of the larger cyber attacks to ever take place through resiliency. So it became a non-story, even though it should have been a huge story. Precisely because of some of the stuff that you're talking about here. But I want to stick with space-based effects for a second here, because it's actually, it's a fascinating area. We're talking about doing things in space that matter here on the ground. Lieutenant General Stephen Whiting recently described a new program embedding Space Force Guardians in the Air Force's Information Warfare Wing to explore how to do offensive operations from space. So when you look at the prospect of space-based effects that today might be hard to conceptualize, what does that roadmap look like? What are you thinking in terms of space-based effects, teaching them, developing concepts of operation around them? What does that look like to you?
Well, the first thing we have to do is the first battlefield, so to speak, in space-based effects is to ensure that all of the capabilities and information provided from space is integrated effectively into operations, right? It's easy to, relatively speaking, it's easy to say, okay, I have a GPS satellite and a GPS receiver, and therefore I can navigate with precision. I've got satellite-based communications and I have a satellite receiver, I can talk.
Right.
It's much harder to say, now I have a tremendous amount of information that comes from surveillance of the battlefield, ground moving target indication, perhaps someday air moving target indication. It's much harder to then take all of that information at massive scale, make sure that I've identified it, characterized it properly, decided whether or not it warrants action, and then integrate that into command and control, decision making, and ultimately weapons loops. And that's the first thing that we have to do, is make sure all of that works effectively. That's key to how we're going to fight in the future. And then you can look at things like, okay, where can I get access? Where can I use that information as a weapon, as I might in other places? Where can I use it to introduce doubt and confusion, or perhaps other things? There's a whole host of things you might think about, just like you do in any other terrain. In some ways, the connectivity through space is just an extension of key cyber terrain, right?
Yeah.
Rather than fiber or wire, I now have RF that connects it all. So all the things you could think about in terms of networks and how networks work and what you can and can't do and what you can protect and how you can operate, now extend that key cyber terrain and therefore opportunities to use it to advantage.
Yeah, and the fact that we're no longer talking about a permissive environment, that pushes the necessity of developing concepts around that, right? We have to be able to see targets on the ground perpetually, and we have to figure out whether or not we use it or not, some way to actually get at them in ways where, in places where you can't just fly a plane in. And this is a huge part of that discussion, and that's like, lasers from space. It's pretty cool. All right.
Well, to pull that thread a little bit more, it is very much like other domains, right? And you have to think about how we use space in a warfight, in an integrated manner with all other domains to achieve the nation's objectives, right? And we can't shy away from that, and we can't think it is somehow special or different. It's part of the warfight.
Yeah.
It's a warfighting domain. It has been for a very long time.
Yeah.
Right. So we have to think about that. I'll tell you, there are things that are unique, though, about space, right? The physics are different.
Right.
The distances are different.
Yeah.
But another difference is the commerciality of space.
Yeah.
And how many commercial systems you've got in space that are doing overlapping missions with what our national security users of space need, right? And so one of the challenges is integrating those commercial data streams into all of these different warfighting contexts and all of these processes and even into kill chains, and doing that in a safe, secure, ethical way.
Right.
That is a challenge in itself, but once we do that, we unlock so much more resiliency and so much more capacity to deliver capabilities to the warfighter.
Yeah, but you have to do it in this way that doesn't necessarily imperil a lot of really important space-based communication satellites that civilians rely on, because all of a sudden they're perceived as a war asset.
Well, they're probably going to be perceived as a war asset, whether they're actually being used or not.
Yeah.
So as a policy matter, I'd say we just have to get past that.
Yeah.
And just like the Navy and the Coast Guard have a mission to protect and defend in the seas, right? The Space Force is inherently got a protect and defend mission in space that's going to apply to non-military assets.
Yeah.
I know it's a policy debate right now, but it's no different than the other domains that we're going to have to protect and defend.
Yeah. So like on space as a domain that's increasingly critical to warfighting, I talked to a lot of Ukrainians, and I talked to a lot of folks in the Army. And between the two of them, they're very enthusiastic about Starlink and the possibility of space-based communications. Going to play a huge role in a lot of maneuver, especially of large formations in the event of great state conflict, or in the reality of great state conflict as it currently exists in Europe. But you have a limited number of providers of that. Are you satisfied with the amount of the diversity of the space comms market as a dual market? There's a commercial aspect to it and there's a military aspect to it. Are you satisfied? You've got Starlink. Is that a diverse enough market for you?
So it is not a diverse enough sector for us. I won't talk specifically about the commercial piece.
Yeah.
I think there's some good capability there and more coming, I firmly believe.
Okay.
But in the force design that our Space Warfighting Analysis Center has just completed, that we've worked with the other services on, we worked with the combat commanders and others.
Yes.
I can't share a whole lot of details, but what I can tell you is the capabilities we need that address the resilience, that address the capacity, that address very specific needs. We have laid that out.
Okay.
That is an investment area we in the Space Force need to address as we go into future budgets.
Okay.
And so there's not enough of it there yet. We've thought very carefully about the types of services required.
Okay.
Where we think you can and should rely on commercial, where you can and should rely on specific military capabilities, how they integrate together. And so I think we've got that design work done, and the design work has shown us we need more investment. Space Development Agency's transport layer is going to be part of that.
Yeah.
Certainly LEO broadband, also still some traditional commercial satellite services in GEO, and some of the types of capabilities you've seen us provide in the past.
Right.
Nuclear command and control, protected communications, but all of those in a really integrated design that work together. The technologies and the capabilities are there. We just have to invest in them to deliver the integrated design.
And you're satisfied that that capability is coming? You're going to see growth?
Correct.
Okay.
It is here or coming, and with appropriate investment, that it is a relatively low-risk technology to deliver.
Right.
Yeah, no, and you know, to pull on that, what the Space Development Agency is doing with the transport layer, I think is going to be really unlock a lot of really interesting capabilities for the DoD. You know, they just launched their first 10 satellites back in April, I think. You know, they're testing them out on orbit, but you know, capabilities like Link 16 from space, optical intersatellite links, you know, can really push a lot of data around and then get it directly down into the hands of the warfighter. I think that's going to be a big leap ahead in capability.
Yeah, we were talking earlier about the Space Development Agency as actually an interesting model for how a lot of the rest of the military can begin to develop resiliency, because you have, speak a little bit to this, you have an entity that you had a capability there, but then they went ahead and they tried to create another capability that was sort of competitive, and the end result is now you have resiliency because you stood up two kind of competing enterprises.
Well, yeah, so I call this the Netflix model, right? If you think back to Netflix, they were a DVD to home business, right? And what they did is they stood up a separate unit within the company, a separate organization to explore streaming, online streaming of content. And they let it compete with their DVD business. And I don't know if you remember, there was a time when they were separate websites, right? And you click through one and it takes you to a totally different layout and page and everything, right? They eventually did merge them together, but just recently they finally shut down the DVD to home business because streaming won out.
Right.
Now, that is how Netflix did not become the blockbuster of its generation, right? That's how they continued to innovate and move ahead. I think that's really the genius behind the way the SDA was set up, and you know, give credit to Deputy Secretary Shanahan and OSD R&E Mike Griffin, who set it up this way to have it as a separate organization. But it is set up to compete with the traditional acquisition arm of the Space Force, Space Systems Command. And it's doing a phenomenal job, to the point that I will hit on the Navy here for a minute. But their other services have similar problems. They continue to invest in legacy systems and aren't innovating them and pursuing alternative architectures, like the aircraft carrier. How many war games have folks sat through where you're like, wow, that's a big juicy target at the sea, in the ocean? Like, why are we still investing in these things?
Yeah.
They have not been able to move on. I think it's a real sign of progress here. The Space Force has moved on.
Yeah. We talked about this a little bit backstage. General Thompson is going to demur the opportunity to yell at the Navy. Remains a big fan of the service.
The Navy is one of our best customers, staunchest advocates, and appropriately critics when they need it.
Yes, okay.
I love the United States Navy.
Okay. Excellent. But I want to turn back to this question of SDA and proliferation, and particularly on-orbit or on-satellite capability. We spent a lot of time today talking about artificial intelligence, and artificial intelligence requires a certain amount of CPU. If you've got access to AWS where you can run your service, then that's fine. But in terms of something that's going to be in a contested environment, you need to have that stuff on-prem. You need to have it on the platform. When you look at a future space architecture, you have optical communications that can exist between them. You have the possibility of neural networks in space, but you also have incredibly harsh environment. How much are you thinking in terms of on-platform capability to do things like machine learning? Where is the thermodynamic threshold where that becomes a yes or a no?
I don't think we know yet, and I think right now the answer is pursue both on-platform capability and moving data off-platform until you find the balance between how you should do that, what you should do on-platform or not. And it's absolutely going to vary based on the mission and what you're trying to perform. There are cases where, for perhaps it's deep intelligence analysis or other sorts of work, you're going to want to get as much of the data off of the satellite as you can so you can fully exploit it and use it maybe over months, weeks, and years. And then there are other cases where I need to be able to move the right amount of data to the right place now and may need to reduce that down to only the smallest set of data necessary, which requires onboard processing and then immediate offboarding. And so I think basically as As the capability to process onboard increases, we should take advantage of it, but we shouldn't automatically assume we're going to do one or the other. I think it's going to vary.
Okay. With that, folks, I have some bad news. Maybe it's good news. I'm not sure. But we've reached the end of our time here at the Defense One Technology Summit. I want to ask you all to join me first in thanking the entire events team over here at GovExec for helping us put this together. And thank you to my panel, too, for sticking through this. And we got drinkies in the hall, so stick around, and we're going to do some beer pong over here with General. So, he's not doing that. His staff is looking at me like, no, we're not doing it. But please join us for some refreshments, and thank you all so much. That's it.